Hey everybody, this is Robot here, Vespa Motorsport here in San Diego, or scooterwest.com, which is our mail order operation here in San Diego. We ship all over the world. We stock nearly every part to do an engine rebuild on any model Vespa. I'm talking a 40s Vespa all the way up to the latest 300. And that includes crankshafts, pistons, gaskets, seals, all the other incidental parts you need to do a rebuild. And that's something unique that we succeed at here at our operations. We stock all the parts. Many other places, they got to order parts from all over the place to get what you need to do an engine rebuild. But we'll just get right to it. I'm pretty much going to do an engine rebuild on both of these modern Vespas. These are both Vespa 300s. They both have different problems. And all the steps of these teardown and rebuild videos are going to carry over to all the other modern Vespas, all the way back to the Vespa ET4, pretty much any of the 4-stroke engines. The one thing that's neat about all the Vespa products is they're kind of like, the way the engines are built is not much different than the way General Motors built the Chevrolet 350 V8 engine. You know, there's tons of interchangeable parts between the different motors. You got on a Chevrolet, you could get a V6, that's like a 4.3 liter, and it carries most of the same parts as the 5.7 liter V8. They just lop off 2 cylinders. Well, with the Vespa, they stick to a very similar engine arrangement for all the different engines, whether they're air-cooled or liquid-cooled. The techniques of how you rebuild them is real similar. There's some variations in some of the tools you use, and obviously major engine parts like crankshafts and pistons. Essentially, the Vespa 300, this motor right here that's missing the top end, you know, carries a lot of the same parts as the liter motor that was introduced in 2001 on the Vespa ET4. Today I'm going to do part 1 of this video, which is how to pull the motor out and do a complete disassembly of the engine. Again, here's 2 different GTS 300s, 2 different problems. I can tell you this one's going to need a lot more work than the one right next to me. So this blue Vespa 300 came down from Los Angeles. The customer said he's heard good things about us and knew he wanted to have major engine work done at our dealership. I think he's asked other shops and they've just suggested you need a whole new motor. I hear that all the time. There's people who call in like, yeah, I need a whole new motor for my scooter. I can tell you there's only a couple major catastrophic failures I've ever seen, maybe 3 in all the time I've been working here with the modern Vespas, where somebody has had so much damage to the engine where they need a complete engine. One thing to keep in mind is a complete engine's about half of what these vehicles cost new. They're very, very expensive. So it might be worthwhile if you just want to swap an engine, you have a very new scooter and you had some sort of catastrophic failure. But for the most part, they're always rebuildable, no big deal. Doing the rebuild, it's only 1 or actually 2 special tools you need to do the bottom end rebuild. All the rest of the tools are just standard hand tools, nothing special, you know, that advanced do-it-yourself mechanic would have. You know, of course, I wouldn't tackle this job as your first mechanical job. I'd mess around with doing services and doing the belt jobs and all the other stuff, and get your hand, you know, get the feel of doing mechanical work before you tackle a major job like a full engine rebuild on one of these modern Vespas. But back to this scooter, it came from Los Angeles. Customer stated he needed a whole new engine for it. The reason being is there was a knock from the engine and the power output's a little low. Fortunately, he did not burn the whole entire motor up. You know, some people just, they hear a problem, they keep on riding or try to limp it home. If there's a problem with the engine, the best thing to do is just stop. Say if the oil light comes on, immediately stop. Tow the scooter somewhere to get oil, obtain oil. If for some reason you ran it low on oil just from failing to check your oil level, you got to keep in mind when you ride these at higher speed, they do consume oil and they don't hold much oil. There's a lot, most of the time I've done rebuilds, it's all preventable. You know, people missed oil changes, they let the coolant go low. they put the transmission together incorrectly and damaged the crankshaft. You know, it's always something that could have been, or not always, but mostly something that could have been prevented. Fortunately, this scooter still starts, but just knowing from the noise, I know it needs the bottom end torn down. It's a little hard to hear it. Right now it's pretty quiet, but if you get on the throttle and put a lot of load on the engine, you'll hear a distinct rapping noise, is what they would call like a rod knock in like a car. Yeah. Hear that bad rapping noise? There it is. The oil light's out, so we know that there's oil pressure on the engine, but that noise, I don't even want to hear it anymore. In real life, it's a lot louder noise than what the microphone's picking up. But that noise there indicates that at one point in time, this scooter was either run out of oil, or it was run low on oil, or the oil was just never changed. And as what happens is the top end of the engine survived. That's why it still makes power and starts, but there's a distinct metallic rapping noise, and that's from the main bearing that's falling apart, you know, and damaged from lack of lubrication. We'll go on to this next one. I already have it apart since I don't need to take two scooters apart at the same time, and I'll show you what's going on with this next one here. So this scooter came in. It was being used on the freeway at high speed, and the customer just stated that, oh, it lost the power and they couldn't restart it. It came into the shop. I cranked it. I could just distinctly hear it had low compression. Sorry I took it apart, but the way a cranking motor sounds, you kind of get used to the normal cranking, that, you know, like where it's the electric starter motors fighting against the compression of the engine. And when the starter sounds like it's just a constant electric motor sound, like kind of with very little change in tone as it's cranking the motor over each revolution, that's kind of an early indication that your compression's low or you have no compression at all. I pulled up the seat bucket. Unfortunately, is what I found was the upper coolant hose popped off this thermostat. And we'll have the other motor part, but you'll see that the thermostat sits right on top of here. These earlier scooters, they use a one-time use clamp, and there's been a couple cases where I've seen the single-time use clamps. I threw away all the old ones, but you'll see them on this next scooter when I tear it apart. Sometimes they get loose and they fail. So unfortunately, the customer never saw the indicator that lets you know it's overheated. On the GTV, it's got an indicator. On many of the GTSs, they have a temperature gauge. So they were just motoring along and probably didn't notice a change in tone in the engine or steam coming off the radiator cap or off the engine because the coolant was all lost out the back. Unfortunately, they rode it until it completely overheated and had like a thermal meltdown of the engine. I already pulled out the motor and pulled the top end, and the top end consists of your cylinder, your piston, and the cylinder head with the valves in it. Other parts all bolted to this. You got the exhaust manifold with an O2 sensor. You got the intake manifold, which is still up with the scooter, along with a lot of the other cables, the air filter, all that stuff. I'll go over the best steps to pull one of these motors out efficiently, where you could do it pretty quick and easy. But I'll kind of go over what's been damaged on this motor. Right when I saw that the thermostat hose was off, there's a couple other telltales that I always notice with an overheated engine. This is your the sensor for your the temperature of the engine, and whenever they're overheated, this plastic actually melts in there and it ends up becoming loose on the sensor. Another telltale is this has been distorted. It no longer tightens down, so it's really easy to pull this out. The thermostat has got like a kind of melted crud coming out of it, so the thermostat's no longer usable. It's been severely overheated. And these are all external things. So this would have been, before I took the motor apart, I would have noticed this kind of stuff. On this side, there's a little clamp that normally would hold the spark plug. Well, it got so hot that it just completely melted the plastic clamp off. And over here is the spark plug boot. And you can see it just turned it into a crispy critter. So it had all the telltales that this motor's been severely overheated. And plus, when I cranked it over, you could sense, listen to the note of the engine where it's cranking it against very little compression and not, barely starting. It kind of wanted to start a little bit, but that was it. And I pulled the thermostat off, and I noticed when I was cranking it, smoke was coming out of the thermostat hose. And it kind of indicates that it's blown past the head gasket. And when you have a head gasket out, when you see some erosion on the gasket, that's usually an indication that the head gasket's been damaged. And just replacing a head gasket is not going to fix this. The head's probably severely warped in my experience. Whenever I've seen a motor that's overheated to the level where it's melted plastic, we could check all the valve seats, and I bet you every single one leaks water out, because the valve seat surfaces have all been distorted. You can also see where the exhaust gas was burning through into the coolant jacket. These holes all the way around here are the coolant jacket, and it's burned past right there. So there's, once I got apart, telltale signs that the head's been severely overheated, not only externally, but internally once you get it apart. The cylinder has metallic galling. The rings are stuck in the piston. This piston and the piston rings are no longer usable. You can see all the rings are stuck in there. And the cylinder is also sustained some damage. You could see the galling on the cylinder walls right there. And again, you can see the burn right into the exhaust jacket, or the coolant jacket, that is. Oftentimes I found if the oil pressure never went low and the scooter had oil pressure, the camshaft is still survived, along with all the other valve train components, such as the rockers, and the hard face on the rockers is all in good shape. Engines that have been starved for oil for quite a long time or had very dirty oil, sometimes those parts may be damaged because their survivability is directly related to the quality of the oil that's in the engine. And like I said, both these bikes, I can tell you that if they weren't run out of coolant or run low on oil, they would be still running just fine on the road. And a testament to that is I've seen scooters that have, or GTSs and specifically, that have like 50,000 miles and they've had regular maintenance. They still are pretty strong, surprisingly, considering it's just a single cylinder 250 or 300 engine propelling the thing. There might be other problems around it, like it may have had a broken drive belt or a coolant leak that was addressed, like the coolant pump leaking. As long as the motor wasn't completely overheated or run low on oil or run with dirty oil, they tend to last quite a long time. All right, so we got this wheeled up on the lift. Of course, a lift like this makes the job much easier. It is possible to do it on the ground. In some of my other videos talking about putting the cylinder kits on, you could support the scooter with either wood blocks or a milk crate and make some sort of wooden base to kind of level the scooter and keep it upright while it's off the center stand. Because one thing you got to keep in mind is whenever you pull the engines, the center stand is part of the engine on pretty much all these modern Vespas. And it makes for a good engine stand, but unfortunately the scooter with just one wheel and no stand or rear wheel doesn't want to stay upright. So you could build a wooden structure that chocks the front tire, much like you're tying down the scooter in the back of a truck, supports the front end. Of course, putting it into a lift with a wheel chock on the front makes the job easy. Before you come to conclusions that you need to do an engine rebuild, such as this one makes a distinct metallic noise, a lot of times you want to check everything else. Check your transmission, make sure there's no parts that are falling apart in there and making noise. I'm going to drain the oil, drain the coolant before I start the work. And much like a doctor, those vital fluids to this engine have telltale signs that will let you know what you may be encountering if you do need to do an engine rebuild. Some of the simple things, maybe the scooter's stalling out and you've looked at everything, go back, check the basics, the spark, make sure the spark's strong enough, make sure you got a brand new fresh spark plug, very inexpensive, change out spark plug. You know, and then second, you would want to check your valve clearance. If there's any valves that have zero clearance, like no clearance, that means when the valves are being held slightly open, you're losing compression through the valve seats and the valves themselves, and the engine won't run very well, will be low on power, and oftentimes be difficult to start and want to stall out. You know, that's part of the regular service on these scooters. Every 12,000 miles, you're supposed to check the valves. Every once in a while, I've seen a situation where a scooter stalls out, needs the valves checked a little earlier, and I find a zero clearance valve. It might be a telltale that you have a problem with the valve, but you know, if you correct the clearance and it runs fine, well then rock the scooter for a while. If it's still not running right, you might have a burned up valve, so you need to pull the top end off, inspect the valves and all that stuff. I'm gonna go ahead and do the vitals on this scooter. I'm talking check everything like I do checking any bike. I already made sure the lights all work, that's all good. I'm gonna see it kind of needs a rear tire soon. And before I start the repair order, I'll go ahead and note everything I find. So, you know, even checking the pressure, because, you know, when it comes time to test ride, I want to have the correct pressure in the tires, you know, once I get the engine reassembled. I'll probably end up quoting a new tire. This tire is past the wear indication. The scooter, I think, has like 6,000 or 7,000 miles on it, something like that. It's a little low, but if that tells you anything, 11 pounds of pressure in the front isn't, you know, that's not a safe pressure. So it kind of states how the scooter's been maintained. You know, a scooter, usually I check the pressure every 2 weeks, or, you know, some of my scooters I don't use that much, so you got to check it every time you take it out for a test ride. Dealing with these little tires, they tend to lose the pressure a lot easier. Since I know I'm going to overhaul this one, I'm going to pull the muffler. I'll see what we find in the oil. So first of all, pull the muffler, much like doing a rear tire. It's going to be a T40 Torex with a stock pipe, and then a 17 millimeter for the exhaust clamp itself. And here I got a general set of tools that I would typically use to do a disassembly. For reassembly, you technically use, probably not the best idea to be using impact wrenches, but in order to get the job quickly done, I'll have an air impact for the larger fasteners, electric impact, that's, you know, a cordless one. It's kind of nice for, you don't have to hook up the hose. I rarely use these for assembly. You don't necessarily need something like this, but these are all wobble head sockets. All the modern scooters use a couple different Torex sizes and hex sizes, so I have some hex sockets. Of course, you can get away with just the regular L-shaped hex sockets, wire cutters, regular wrench, some larger wrenches, needle nose, pliers, pick to pull things apart. You may need a magnet because you're going to drop a fastener or two. Pretty much I'm just going to go through zipping this all off, and it all goes pretty quick from there. So T40, you want to stay really organized, much like a surgeon, you know, working on whatever, a human or an animal or whatever. So, you know, I have magnetic trays, a couple of them, usually for any job that I'm doing. And if this is your first time disassembling this, you may want to bag each of the fasteners. So I'm going to take all the fasteners for the muffler. You may want to bag those fasteners and note that they're for the exhaust, or, you know, including the order that the washers go. You know, there's a special lock washer, a flat washer. I mean, I've kind of been working on these long enough. I could just, you could throw all the fasteners in a bag. I'd probably figure them out, no problem. But, you know, it's definitely important to stay organized when you're doing an engine overhaul, because you're going to end up with like 100 parts. You know? Pull that screw out. You know, sometimes those are seized up, you know, from a rusty old engine. And the muffler is a little warm because I did have the thing running. Get the clamp out of the way and pull the muffler off. More fasteners, got your exhaust clamp, you got the graphite gasket that's likely to be replaced upon assembly. So 24mm socket, already got it on the air tool here. And oil looks pretty dark. You know, you can measure the quantity that's going to come out. Let's pull the strainer out and see what's on the strainer. And there's already the telltales that it's got a big end bearing burned out. This, like I said, this is in the early stage, but you see those kind of brass colored and kind of dull silver metal particles. You should never find a whole bunch of those on there. I mean, one or two here and there, you know, maybe from the aluminum engine, you know, casting. But if you find like a little thimble full of it, you know, or get that much on your finger, it tells you something's falling apart in the engine and depositing oil in, or depositing in the oil. So, and I don't really know the history of this bike or how it's been serviced. You know, if that oil is, if that's 6,000 mile oil, if it's original. I suspect it was run really low and it was topped off at some point. Another thing, I don't find it really all that necessary, but in the past I have taken oil filters apart. You know, these steel oil filter casings, they can be, yeah, I'm just destroying this filter because we're going to replace it, but you could just cheat it with a wrench. This is one of the newer style smooth filters. And if you cut the filter open, you'd probably find similar metal particles in the pleats of the paper element that's encased inside this metal filter here. So I'm just going to leave it there, let it drain all the oils out, and go about taking other parts of the motor. 2015 later is going to have a wheel speed sensor in the rear. You know, while if you're on the earlier ones, you're not going to find this because they don't have the anti-lock braking system, so they don't need a rear wheel speed sensor. So I find the easiest way versus disconnecting the sensor is just to remove the sensor in the harness. So it kind of snakes through all this. So anything 2015 and newer is going to have these wheel speed sensor in the rear. Just for the 300, the smaller bikes, it's only in the front. And we'll set that aside up there. And the way I'm organizing the hardware, that works best for me. Like I said, it might not work best for you. Everything I take off from this right side, I'm going to put in this tray. I'm going to have a tray on the left side, so fasteners that come off on the left side will go in that tray. I'm going to let the oil drain a little bit more. I'll put the cap back in there. Get the cotter pin out of there. Lever it out. That's trash. Don't need that part anymore. Got the cap. Still got the 24mm socket. Again, with like air tools, I mean, you could lock things up and do it all by hand, but makes the job a whole lot easier with the air tools. 17mm for the left side shock. So you got a nylock nut there. And while I'm on the side, I'm going to hold the main engine bolt. You can see the pivot bolt goes all the way through. I'm going to go ahead and just loosen it now since I got the air tool with the wrench. So there's, again, a nylock nut on this side. So you saw the whole engine shift just a little bit. Same nut is for the shock, so no big deal there. And I'm not pulling the motor right this moment, but I'm just making the best use of what tools I have on hand. So there's my oil filter. I typically have another bin I don't have out for all the parts that are going to end up going in the parts washer to get clean. So put the cap back in. Just always be aware if your engine, you know, has oil or doesn't have oil. If you need a reminder, you know, maybe worth putting a marker on your, you know, on the oil dipstick or something, indicating you don't have oil in the engine. Want to get all the coolant out of the engine. So there's our old oil. I'm sure if I drain it, I'll find more metallic particles in the bottom from the damaged crankshaft. You know, have lots of rags on hand, keep everything clean. And with the oil, if you're a home mechanic, you know, oftentimes at like regular auto parts stores, they allow you to dispose of the oil there. This is the one-time use clamps that are used on most modern Vespas. Just recently, they have gone to like a worm gear style clamp that's a little bit more reliable. And I would suggest, you know, putting the worm gear clamps on it versus reusing these. They do look a little cleaner. We do have those available. One thing is sometimes draining the coolant can be kind of a messy job. So, you know, again, kind of try to catch the coolant. Now, I still have the cap in the engine, so it's not going to drain all that fast until I loosen the cap. So up on the top, there's going to be a T25. Loosen the radiator cap, and just do it slowly because it's going to want to come rushing out pretty fast when you open the cap up. Yep. And even before I took this apart, the coolant level is fine on it. You know, it wasn't an issue where it was overheated or anything. And there you go. So once the cap's just crack loose, it's going to want to dump the coolant pretty rapidly. One thing I failed to mention is before I started the tear down this motor, you can see everything looks nearly brand new in here. I pressure washed everything before I started taking it apart and then blew it all off with compressed air just to kind of clean it and dry it. It definitely makes for a much cleaner, you know, engine overhaul. You know, starting with a fresh engine, nice clean engine that you're pulling out. When you're pulling this greasy, messy engine, you know, you're going to end up contaminating everything with grease, and it just ends up being a really messy job. You know, trying to stay clean, that's, along with being organized, you know, those are two things that are pretty important when you're doing an overhaul. So I got the thermostat right here, and it's held with these T25 Torx screws. And since this motor wasn't overheated, I suspect the thermostat housing is going to be just fine. So instead of disconnecting the hose, you can just loosen the thermostat, and that will allow the rest of the coolant to drain out. And you can just hear right when I cracked it, the rest of the coolant started draining out. On the Vespas, they use quite a few zip ties. I did notice when I took this apart, there's a screw that's missing, and I'll go ahead and replace that screw upon assembly. But you can see all the spots where there's zip ties, and if you're not familiar with where they go, is what I'll do is I'll take a paint pen and put two scribes along where the zip ties go, and that kind of gives you a good indication where, you know, all these zip ties would have gone. You know, so when you cut them out, you'll remember where they go. Another way is also just taking a couple photos of the engine prior to disassembly. You know, it's pretty important that you put all these zip ties back in place. They kind of keep everything tidy and organized, along with keeping cables in the right spots. And this one in particular has a little piece of sheathing on it. Yeah, I'm not going to touch any of these zip ties because I'm going to pull the whole entire manifold. Actually, I'm wrong. I'm going to cut that one there. So I can disconnect the fuel injector when the time comes. That one's for the starter wire, disconnected. So keep in mind when you're ordering parts, you want to make sure you have all these zip ties when you reassemble your engine. You know, sometimes you just think about the parts you need. You know, whatever, a crankshaft. You know, a lot of times it's pretty easy to not order everything that you need. You see, lift the thermostat. A couple things I'll show you what's on these. You got the two screws. You got the thermostat itself. There's still going to be a little bit of residual coolant. You use compressed air to blow the remaining coolant out if you like. You know, be careful using compressed air, because you may end up with coolant in your face, but got a little bit more coolant out of it. And same with the engine. You know, once they're blown out, then it's not going to be dripping as much. So we'll dispose of that coolant. Again, like a lot of auto parts stores, they'll take the home mechanics coolant. It's not something you want to pour down the sink. So both the upper and lower coolant hoses are disconnected, thermostat's pulled away. While I'm up here, I'll start cutting some of the other clamps and disconnecting stuff that I don't need. So this is your breather hose from the valve cover. Again, it's one of those one-time use clamps. You could replace it with a more traditional clamp. And there's different techniques I use. You can sometimes just carefully pry these until the little clip pops off. It is possible to save them. And see, just working on it a little bit, loosen the clamp enough, and then you could pull the remains of the clamp off. Or you could use a heavy set of diagonals and just cut them. Same with this thermostat. Since, you know, I did disconnect it to kind of regulate the coolant flow, but I'll just show you another one because I'm going to replace these with the much higher quality. So I got underneath that little tab and then just roll it off and you'll be able to disconnect it. And those are pretty much found throughout, you know, on all the clamps of the, you know, all the radiator clamps, all that stuff. But I found at the engine, it's kind of important to replace them because those hoses vibrate and move quite a bit. The ones at the radiators don't tend to have too many problems. I'm going to go ahead and disconnect the, this is the fuel injector connector. You want to push that little tab to disconnect that. You got your thermostat, or not thermostat, this is your thermistor. That's, and I'm having difficulty getting to the little plastic pry. Is what I'll use. I'll just use a pick and pry it a little bit. Is what I was pulling on. I just pulled this ever so slightly to release the connector. I've seen these broken before, and that, you know, doesn't do any good. One thing to keep in mind, you don't want to get moisture inside that connector. It will end up causing a false reading to the ECU on the engine temperature. That could cause some problems. All these clamps here, again with a pick, get under it, pry those clamps open. There's a clamp right here, pry that open. There's a zip tie with the fuel injector under here. Might have better luck with a small. Get the small diagonals in there. You can't see what I'm doing, but there's a connector for the O2 sensor that's on the exhaust header. And if it has never been removed, it most likely will still have the hose clamp on the, or the cable tie on there. Zip tie or whatever you want to call it. There we go, cut that one. And I'll reach down here. I'll show you the connection for the O2 sensor. You pull that up, and it's just that little tab. You just pry it up and push the connector away. So there's the O2 sensor. There's the wiring on the harness. We want to release all that stuff from the harness there. This is a single screw. Some models, they do not have this little plastic cover here. Some do. Yeah, another way to keep track with screws is just put it back in. I mean, you don't need to go to town and thread it in like all the way, but just enough, you know, where it stays in place. So then you won't forget about the fastener. This little plate retains all the cables for your the voltage regulator and also the pickup for the engine. You know, the crank angle sensor, as they would call it. So one more zip tie. So far, I think I've cut 7 zip ties or something. And I'm getting these clamps, again, the similar style clamps. you can pull this bracket out of the way, and that's why I loosened the bracket. And this is your wheel speed sensor. If you want to cut more zip ties, I'm just going to pull the wheel speed sensor up out of the scooter, and I'll, leave the sensor connected. So for the voltage regulator connection, you push that tab, disconnect it. And this one's on a little thing there, so when you put it back on, you want to slide that connector back on in place. So now this is completely disconnected. Best tool for disconnecting that is a wobble 8, but it is possible to do with just a regular socket. But the wobble, you gain a little bit more angle to get to the fasteners. Just a little easier, and I'm using a T-handle. Kind of works a little quicker than a ratchet in some situations. It'd be even faster if I used electric tools, but. And all three of these fasteners are all identical that hold the intake manifold. And this one you can snake through right past where the fuel hose is. And you can see the whole intake manifold now is kind of loose from the engine. And it's good practice when you pull an engine to have, you just got to remember it's in there, but something to prevent fasteners and dirt going into the intake. So I just shoved a little bag in there. While we're up here, a couple more there's a ground strap that's on the back of the engine here. And that's on the rear connection of the starter motor. And like I said, it's up to you for your preference. You could drop the screw back into place. I could tell you one thing, we're going to be splitting the engine cases, so those fasteners, I'm going to have to loosen them back again because the starter motor is going to need to be removed. So there's our ground. You got your starter. I already cut that zip tie. This is your electric start on the relay, and it pulls off. It's a single quick connect there. Spark plug caps out of the way, ground terminals, starter connections are loose. Air box is still attached to the engine, but pretty much everything that I need to do from the top is done. And all I did is I lowered it just because I wanted to loosen the thermostat, let the coolant out. But I was like, the way I think about it is like, okay, I'm up here, let me just get everything done that I need to do up in this top area. So I'm back to the bottom of the engine now that I raised the scooter back up. I'm going to start disconnecting the remainder of the parts to pull the engine out. So I got a 10mm deep wobble, which is quite a unique socket. Again, you could do this just with a regular quarter drive socket, quarter inch drive socket, 10mm, and a regular wobble adapter would do the same thing. You got to feel your way around. I know the video is not catching this, but there's two fasteners that hold the intake or the exhaust manifold to the cylinder head. And I cracked the one loose. Then you want to move over to the second fastener. Go between the two. And now they're pretty loose. Drop the wrench out of there. And now I'm just on there with my fingers. And it's critical you get this header out of the way. It's pretty hard to pull. I mean, it probably is possible to yank the motor out with this header in the way, but it definitely makes the job a lot easier if it's not in here. So it hangs up with the. There's two the copper coated steel nuts. They're like a weird size. They're M7, which is a not so common size. So you got the two fasteners. I already cut the zip tie and disconnected the O2 sensor, and there's your exhaust manifold with the O2 sensor pulled out. So what I'm going to do is jack the scooter up and make sure the wheels clamp quite tight. So you can see it wants to drip a little bit more out. That's perfectly normal. I'm going to put the center stand back down and just rest it on the center stand there. And unfortunately, we got to get the wheel off. Pull the brake caliper out of the way. So a 6mm Allen will do the trick for pulling the rest of the swing arm off. Now keep track of the screws you pull out. You know, if this was really seized on there, we do make a special tool to pull that off. This model year, they have is what they call is the tone wheels mounted to the fasteners of the wheel. So I'll just go ahead and T25, all these little guys removed. The later years, this wheel actually, it bolts to the wheel itself and not to the wheel studs. So it's a different arrangement. Now pull the tone wheel off along with all the fasteners that hold that. Of course, an earlier model wouldn't have any of that stuff on it. I think these are 13s. And they have their own washers on them as well. I'm pulling all 5 of these out. So the wheel, I'm just going to pull it off to the side for right now because I want to leave the wheel with the engine. So now off to the other side. And this is our brake caliper right here. And they're M6 Allens. And if you like, put the fasteners with the brake caliper, and now the wheel can go back on. And I just want the wheel. If you saw the overheated motor, I just had the motor resting on the center stand of the wheel. So I just want to put one of these in. I'm just putting one fastener in it because we're not riding it like this. And we got to put the brake caliper all back on, and I'll probably end up changing the tire. Well, the whole motor's coming apart, but I just want to make it easier for the motor to get wheeled out. There's our speed sensor. It's got a single fastener holding it, 6mm fastener. Uses an 8mm socket. So again, I'll use my little wobble, and that screw also holds the inner fender. So now that's all free, and we'll be able to pull the motor out. I'm going to put all these fasteners off to the side. If you like, you could bolt this back in place. It kind of keeps the wheel from wanting to walk its way off the shaft, but I'm going to tear the motor completely down, so I'll leave that off. Shock is disconnected. Wires are good. Coolant hose is good on this side. Nothing else I got to do on this side, so we'll move on to the other side of the engine here. So the brake hose is retained by, there's 2 clamps that go to the belt cover here. Goes back. And then there's 2 clamps underneath the oil pan that hold these rubber grommets on the brake caliper. So the whole idea, the reason I took the brake caliper out this way is I didn't have to disconnect the hydraulic. You know, if you disconnect the hydraulics, you're gonna have to bleed the whole brake system. This is a newer scooter, doesn't need brake fluid bled, so that's always the best way, is just take the whole caliper off. So just to make the job a little easier, it is possible to remove the engine with this in place, but I want to make the job just a little easier, and I got to gain access to a couple more fasteners that hold the air box on. There's a 10mm fastener back there. The front one was a T25 Torex. Pull the skirt off from the back. Now we got a little bit more room, and I'll put the fasteners back in place. Just get them out of the way. Anytime you take body work off, you want to set it in a safe place where it's not going to get damaged. On this side, you got a clamp for the coolant hose. Disconnects much like the electrical clamps. I have that single electrical wire that if you wanted to disconnect it from down here, you could. You know, but I showed how to disconnect it from the top, so you could have left it at the top too, you know, and pulled the motor out with the wire still connected. But we're gonna get the belt cover all off because this motor is gonna need the cases split. So every single part of the motors, or nearly every part of the motor, is gonna be taken apart. Loosen the air box. It's kind of silly, but the front fastener is gonna be a Phillips, at least on these newer models. The older ones are going to be all Phillips, so there's a long screw that's a Phillips, and the other two are going to be Torex fasteners. And this may be an ideal time that you want to take the covered air filter off. Maybe you need to inspect the air filter. You know, it's definitely something you don't want to overlook. So I have the 3 fasteners to hold the air box on, and now that's lifted out of the way. You got the single rear shock. Hoses out of the way, brakes are out of the way. Get the impact, and we'll pull the shock, and the motor's gonna be out in a second. It's a bolt and nut, shock's disconnected. There's these 2 spacers. And oftentimes this spacer will get jammed into the shock. I'm gonna leave it alone, but we'll mess with that later. Get those out of the way so they're not lost. Again, there's still one left up in there. All right, so what I'll do is I'll lower the engine. This is the pivot bolt. See how I just knocked it in? Didn't take much to push it in. And I adjusted the pressure of this jack stand, so there's not much pressure on this bolt. So now I should be able to just easily pull it out, and this single spacer will come right out with it. And now you'll see that the motor is gonna wanna start pulling back from the scooter here. So I'm just putting a bungee cord, and what this is doing is holding the all this stuff up, so yeah, out of the way. So now we can pull the engine out. There's a fuel hose. You want to make sure that's not going to hang up. I have the sensor for the wheel speed. The only wires that will be going with the engine is this start wire right here that has the connector that's pulled from the relay, and the wires for the stator plate. So I'll leave those with the engine. Everything else is staying with the frame. So I'm going to go up a little bit with this. See, I'm jacking the frame up, and and now I'm able to pull the motor. I went just a little bit too high, I can see. And you can kind of inch the motor out without it dragging on everything. And go even higher with the frame. And we've almost revealed the motor here. Okay, that was like 4 minutes, not 2 minutes like I said last. Oh well. But I don't know, it's pretty simple to pull the motors out of these. Once you know everything that's got to get disconnected and so on, not that big of a deal. So on this side's the inspection cover for finding top dead center of the crankshaft. And the way that easily turn the engine over is you got to pull the belt cover. So I have all 11 fasteners for the belt cover off. Keep in mind, some have the clamps. And you can watch the belt videos, kind of have details on what goes on with the belt cover. Or not what goes on with the belt cover, but what's under here and how to disassemble it. Kind of not saying it right. Get the single nut off. And dipstick comes out. Washer falls out there. And the dipstick back in. Belt cover's out of there. Set it aside. Now we'll start to zip apart the top end, and I'll show you how to find top dead center pretty simply once we get the valve cover off. So all 10mm fasteners, and you might as well just discard all the gaskets and rubber seals, because definitely want to replace those anytime you tear apart the engine. Pull the valve cover off. I've also found if you're going to clean everything, you use the valve cover as like a little parts tray. I'm going to turn this motor over. If you watch some of the cylinder kit videos, you can see the marks on the, there's one that says 2V and one that says 4V. And you want that 4V mark to point at 12 o'clock, or at least the very top of the cylinder. So you can see the 4V mark is pointing right towards the center of those two humps, on the valve cover there. So there's top dead center, good right there. Got a couple more fasteners with the M10. Since I took the valve cover off, you want to take the cam tensioner center. Be careful, because there's going to be an O-ring and a spring that will pop out. Sometimes they have an aluminum crush washer. Pull that out, change over to the 8mm. Now pull these two out. And that's your tensioner. And the reason I took the center of the tensioner out is I could see how the tensioner looks, and that gives you a good indication of the health of the cam chain. And that looks about normal, what a newer engine would be. If the cam chain was completely worn and you found that all the way out, it'd be a good idea to replace the cam chain, indicating that the adjuster or the tensioner can no longer put tension on the chain. So that's something that's just a nice telltale before you get too far into the engine. Look at it. I'll take the center off, and this is, depending on the year, there's different variations of this hardware that's in there. You want to pull this little spring off, and that's your auto decompression spring. Just take care when you're pulling this off. I put my finger back there. The reason being is, as I'm pulling this counterweight off, I was holding that little plastic little washer thing. Otherwise, it just kind of wants to roll down into the bottom of the motor. Probably not the best thing to happen. Don't want to lose parts down there. That little guy pulls off, part of the counterweight. And again, the motor's still at top dead center. There's two parts, and I'll go ahead and derail the chain. And there's also a plate behind it. And it's easier to disassemble parts of the head right now. This is the plate that retains the cam. There's two 5mm fasteners and the 8mm socket to pull off this thrust plate. And with the cam at top dead center, you should be able to move the cam. If it was, if the valves had zero clearance and they were, you may need to loosen all these adjusters before you pull the cam. Again, you want to check to see if you got, clearance on all the valves before you go any further. Because if you had zero clearance on any of these valves, that might be your problem. And you might be taking a motor that you suspect that has low compression apart for no reason, and all it needed was a valve adjustment. So cam comes out. You can use a pick. You can't really mix up the intake and exhaust rockers. They're different. Some models, such as the 2-valve motors, are symmetrical. I always put the rods back in there, the pivot pins. Before I even put this away, you want to look at this surface here, and it looks quite good. There's just a small amount of galling, which isn't surprising considering this motor probably was run low on oil, but it's nothing I could catch with my nails if I had my gloves off. It feels perfectly smooth, so I wouldn't hesitate to use this. Same with the cam. I kind of threw it in a bin. I want to wipe all the oil off and look at the lobes. You could see there is some galling on this cam lobe right here. You know, that is, I would call that questionable. You know, maybe worth replacing the cam. This cam is perfectly smooth. I don't think the hard face has been worn through, but I can drag this pick across it and catch some of the, that metallic kind of scraping, or they call that galling. So it may be worthwhile replacing the cam, considering this motor was probably run low on oil. And again, look at that one. It has a small, less galling than the exhaust, and it looks okay. So in the valve cover, I jammed all the parts that are that have to do with the top end. They're all in the valve cover, and I'll send all those parts off to get cleaned. Or I won't send them off, they'll just go into parts washer. What am I talking about? You got the two cam tunnel bolts, and there's 5 or 6 millimeter fasteners with an 8 millimeter socket. You pull them out. They're unique. They're only bolts of that size. You don't want to use an impact to loosen the 4 head bolts. So I got a 12 millimeter deep socket, and I'm going to crack them off, just about a 1/4 turn each, or a little less than a 1/4 turn. And see, I'm going to crisscross action here. Yeah, I suspect this whole top end is going to be reused, so you don't want to, if you loosen one of these too quickly, there's the chance of distorting the surface of the head. And I found if these haven't been overheated, there's not too often that they suffer from distorted head. And I'm kind of just tipping the socket over so I get the screws out. These ones, you know, you can't really get them out. Always have a magnet or a needle nose or something. There's a magnet right here. So you can just retrieve fasteners pretty easily. So there's your 4 head bolts there. All right, so before I even pull the head, there's still 2 hoses connected to the cylinder and the head. I'll get on this side. Again, with those pesky hose clamps, you can either cut them like that, and that will loosen them up. You can see a small amount of coolant dripping out of the, or you can give them a little twist to break them free as well. So. The best way to get hoses off is you can't really pull them off because they're on the barb. You know, the barb is kind of like a Chinese finger trap or whatever, those like toys that you never ever see anymore. I'm prying the hose off, and that's how you get the hose off easily. So pull the hose off, and same with this one, we'll get the clamp out of the way. And just like the other hose, pry it off. It's probably gonna leak a little bit of coolant. No, not too much, just a little bit dripping out. And now you can pull the cylinder head and cylinder off. All right, so I have a rag under there because there's gonna be oil and coolant leaking. Pull the head off. I'll pull the head gasket. I know I saw. There's 2 dowels that line up the head. One's still stuck in the cylinder head. The other one I just pulled right out. The head gasket still looks pretty good. I don't see any burn marks like as if it was overheated. That's not going to be reused. All these little O-rings got to be pried out before you pull the cylinder head off. And you could pull the cylinder up and it will kind of dislodge the O-rings, but a lot of times I just use a pick and get them out of there, so it makes the job a little easier. And they kind of want to tear a little bit as they're pulled out. They're definitely not reusable. Again, using a pick, I'm just kind of digging into them so I catch them, and then you can pull them out. And the cylinder, you know, whenever you're doing a teardown, you want to have a soft-faced hammer, whether it's brass or you know, more coolant's going to want to leak out as we're doing this job here. And sometimes you could catch the O-rings onto those the threads of the studs, and they'll pull right out. But there you go. Let's break the O-rings out of there. I want to further inspect the cylinder. It is possible to take the cylinder out, leaving the piston stuffed in the cylinder, but I'm not going to bother doing that. I pulled the tensioner out. I'm just going to go ahead and pull the rest of the cylinder off. And so far it looks pretty good. I still see crosshatch marks in the cylinder wall. And both sides, leaking fluids on the ground, I'll wipe up. These gaskets come in 3 different thicknesses. I find that most engines just use the 0.6 of a millimeter, 0.6. Sometimes you can find it, but oftentimes you gotta take a caliper and just measure it. If you're putting a new crankshaft in there, you know, it's best to figure out the deck height and calculate the correct base gasket. Although, like I said, most of them are 0.6 of a millimeter, and I would say it's safe to say you could just put a 0.6 in there. Cylinder walls look okay. I can check all the ring-in gaps when I get the piston out, and I'll clean the piston up. Before you pull the clips out, you know, shove a rag so you're not losing parts in the bottom of the bottom end here. So on this side, there's the clip, and you have the one little depression that I could pull the clip out with a good set of needle nose. So I got my needle nose in there, and you know, these clips, they're one-time use, so just pull it right out. Don't bother saving that. And then you could push the pin through. You may need a piston pin puller. Oftentimes, if they're not too galled up, you could carefully just give it light little taps to get the pin out. And you don't even need a hammer. I mean, oftentimes the clip's a little better to get off from the, you know, take the clip out from this side. See, I'm just using something light like a screwdriver handle to tap the piston through. The connecting rod is damaged, so I'm not too worried about it, but normal practice is you want to be hammering on this. So, and the pin is almost nearly all the way through. You can just grab the edge of it, usually pull it out. If it still isn't going to want to come out, continue tapping it until it pops all the way out. And there's the piston released. And I always tend to want to check, see how that goes in there. There should be no play whatsoever, or very, very little, not really discernible by moving it by hand here. But I'll show you what the problem is. The big end bearing is underneath this large end of the rod. See how the rod goes in and out? That's what all that metallic noise was. So the bearing is completely trashed in there. So unfortunately, you need to replace the whole entire crank. And also, it doesn't turn all that smooth anymore. So we'll take everything off the, I guess that would be your left side of the engine normally. So take the variator all apart. And if you didn't have an air tool, you could use the variator holder. Take all this stuff apart. You want to have a clean surface, set all these parts aside, you know, so you remember how they all go back together. But the complete transmission variator's got to be all out of the way. Split the engine, get that crankshaft out. And if I can get my fingers under there, probably not. So it's probably gonna lose some variator weights, but oh, only one weight. There we go. Back plate comes off. And all this stuff, I'll just set it all aside because I'll clean it all, inspect all those parts. We're gonna want to take the oil pan off, which is gonna be quite a messy job here. Usually there's a little bit of oil still in there. So, in a crisscross kind of, you know, keep track of all the brackets that come off. All these fasteners, fortunately, are all the same length, so nothing to worry about. And the last one. And you can see there's a little bit of oil still dribbling out. And I have rags. I can see a huge mess of metallic garbage in there. I'm gonna throw all the screws that go to that in there, have a trash can ready to go, discard all these old gaskets. They're completely useless. Get all these dowels out of here. There's 3 dowels for this little cover. And the last thing is this piston here. Make sure it goes in and out smoothly. If there's anything, I've seen where one of these pistons gets stuck and it will cause low oil pressure and engine damage. Especially with a motor that's had this much metal going through it. You see that's just all metal particles in there. Set all that aside. That's all gonna be stuff that's gonna need to be cleaned. You could prevent the motor from leaking more oil out, jamming a rag in there if you like. This little shield covers up the oil chain. And like I said earlier, this is, so far everything I'm taking apart is nearly identical to a 2001 EP4 or something. It's not that much different, but you could see there's a chain that goes up to this, and that's what drives the oil pump. The one difficult part of this job, or the most difficult part that to do without a specialized tool, is to remove this timing seal. This is all-in-one timing cover and a seal. So it's a rubber gasket on the outside, and it's got a rubber seal, and it's all vulcanized and made in one step or something, you know. And unfortunately, every time you take it out, it's destroyed, and you got to replace it. You can see the 2-threaded bosses in there. You can see it's got a special shape to it. So when you remove it, it needs to have equal pressure pulling out, and when you install it, it needs to be aligned perfectly so these grooves line up with the cam chain. Some of the very older models and some of the newer models, they have, not on the 300s, but on the 150s and the 50cc stuff, that this whole thing is aluminum, and you just take 3 screws out and you can yank it out. Unfortunately on this one, it's the one-time use seal, you know, 828, I don't remember what the part number is, something like that. But we'll get to that when we reassemble it with a new seal. I'm gonna show how to use, you know, using the factory tool. I've heard of people changing the seal without factory tools. You'd want to very carefully align the new seal and drive it in with a punch, make sure it's perfectly square. You'd probably want to put tape all around this to protect the seal lip from folding, which is a common problem with the seal when you're installing. Even with the factory tool, it's likely to fold the lip. In removal, it just takes some brute force. I'm gonna put some bolts in there and you can pry it out carefully. I'm not gonna show how to do it because I've never attempted to do it without the factory tools, but I do know it is possible and people have done it. The factory tool, I think, is several $100s. If you're gonna tackle a job like this, this step, if there's one thing you could bring the engine to a local dealership to have them do, it might be just to remove and install that seal. Here's the factory tool. Part number on it's 8140729, and I've never seen an aftermarket version of this tool out. I put 2 nuts in here to retain the 2 fasteners. And what you want to do is the fine threaded part of this that's larger needs to be threaded in just slightly. And you want to line up these 2 threaded holes to the old seal. And you're kind of doing it blind, unfortunately. And I'm all... There we go. So get those 2 fasteners threaded in. And is what I found is if you don't thread these in all the way, they have a tendency to want to pull out the inserts, and then you're going to have to resort to some medieval brutal techniques to pulling the seal out. And there's other parts of the tool, but they're only used for installation. So the small threaded part of it just right when it bottoms out on the crank. And you want to do this before you split the engine cases. It turns into a big mess if you try to do this before. So there you go. It's bottom out against the end of the crank, and all this tool's doing is it's pulling on the those 2 threaded bosses on the seal. As square as it can be. So it pulls the seal out pretty nicely, but unfortunately, you can see the seal's been distorted and damaged. And part of that is also the tensioner for the oil chain there. So we'll keep this tool. That can now be discarded, unfortunately. And we're going to go ahead and remove the other parts of this, the timing chain here and the oil pump drive chain there. There's this upper tensioner slide. There's a single 6mm fastener, needs an 8mm socket to pull the screw off. And there's a little spacer that jiggles out of there. So that little spacer goes like that, fastener. You can see the oil pump drive will want to spin on the crankshaft. Get a 10mm socket and something to jam up the oil pump drive. So 10mm socket. There's 2 sprocket holes in this oil pump right there. You could just jam something in there to hold tension against it, and then spin the single fastener off the 10mm socket. This is a special type of washer that has a dome to it. Make sure you install it in the correct orientation. Derail the chain. I just popped it off the shaft, and you lift the sprocket out of there. Sprocket can go any way you want, kind of back on, there's nothing. And now you can pull these chains out of here. There's the oil pump drive chain, the sprocket for the oil pump drive. There's an O-ring underneath here that tends to want to bind up that sprocket drive. Now roll the little O-ring off the crankshaft. This O-ring definitely will be replaced. This little shield plate pulls off. And this timing sprocket pulls off. And this is keyed. You see on the bottom of there, it keys to a little pin that's pressed into the crankshaft. And there's your chain that we're going to reuse, and there's the sprocket. Another thing that may be replaced, just to be on the safe side, is the oil pump. Especially when I find a bottom end that's full of just metal flakes, you know, without a doubt, the oil pump has ingested some metal particles, and it may be damaged. It's pretty inexpensive, and in order to save the crankshaft, I'd likely replace it. You can take it apart and inspect the lobes. If they look galled or have metal, like scrapes in them from the metal going through, you would likely replace this whole entire unit. Anytime I see a bottom end failure, I just tend to replace this oil pump. It's not worth checking out. There's also a gasket in there that pulls right out. Before we even get to the other side of the engine, I'm going to pull the starter motor off. So there's two fasteners. The one fastener was loose because it had the what do you call it? The ground strap to it. And oftentimes you can just wiggle these straight back. And if it's being a little stubborn, you can just give it a couple taps. And just make it come straight back. And starter motor's out of the way. So we got the motor partly on its side. It's kind of dumping oil out and all that kind of fun stuff. We're gonna have to remove the center stand pivot. So a 17mm wrench on one side, 17 socket on the other. You gotta be careful with the motor kind of in this position. It's kind of resting on the center stand and the tire, and I'm also slipping around in there we go. You know, loosening the spring is always never all that easy on these things. You know, for the so I got the pivot out for the center stand. Now we could just dislodge the springs and get them out of the way. And like I said, it doesn't make the job too easy with the motor flopping around like this, but normally I do this on a teardown table. There's like a special table that we have that everything that comes out of the motor drains into a basin, so it's like makes the job a lot neater than doing it on this little workbench here. I'm just doing it out here because light's a little bit better. Where'd my spring puller go? There we go. So one thing about these springs is they're under a ton of tension, even with the I got the pivot bolt out of there. So get the center stand out of the engine here, or off the engine. So center stand's out of there. Now we can lay the motor on its side right like this. And now everything on this side has to come off. So we're gonna get the oil or the water pump cover off. 3 screws. It's best to use a little impact. Of course, it leaks a little more coolant. The O-ring can get discarded. And next we'll get the cover off. And the reason that the water pump cover has to come off is when you put this cover back on, you got to be able to turn the water pump. So kind of a crisscross pattern. Keep in mind, there's this cable bracket here. There's the O2 sensor bracket. And this typically you'd be taking this stuff off if you were doing a water pump job as well. One screw that's a little longer goes in that. All the other fasteners are the same length. Under here is your oil pressure sensor. Just a single clip that holds that. And on the sides of these cases, you can tap these tabs, and those are so you can loosen up the case easily. And just pull it off. The only resistance you really have is the magnets of the flywheel. This gasket, of course, is going to get discarded. You know, and inside there's your stator plate. There's the oil seal for the water pump. Another thing to keep in mind when the engine eats a lot of metal in there, you'll find this pickup is magnetic. So there's going to be metal particles on this that you're going to need to clean off. We'll take this whole entire part and clean it in the parts washer. And same with the inside of this flywheel here. The single spring clip here, that stays with the water pump. So in the center of the flywheel is a special type nut that had that spring that engages with your water pump. You're going to need a 24mm socket to remove it. There is a Piaggio special tool that engages with the pins in here that allows for, you know, if you wanted to use something other than an air tool to remove it. Got that removed. There's a single washer. If I can get it off. There you go. So set those aside. You can see the Woodruff key right through that slot right there. And next, I want to pull, when I pull the this off, I want to pull it out with a gear. So a single Phillips screw right there, and this clip comes up with it. And what that does is just a thrust for the starter gear. That's all starter gear, and underneath this flywheel is a one-way clutch for the starter. Next, you're going to need the other special tool that we do have available is the GTS flywheel puller. And you want to thread it on quite a few turns, and hopefully till it bottoms out. When it's bottomed out, that's good. And you want to go in clockwise. So, see it cracked the flywheel there, or cracked it off, and you can pull that up. And it reveals the starter gears underneath. So underneath here is a one-way clutch. This gear comes out, and this is your one-way clutch. Sometimes you got to pull this Woodruff key out. You're going to have to reuse that for the new crankshaft that we'll end up putting in here. And this is just on a bushing. You can see the brass bushing in there. And see how it's a one-way clutch? So it only allows the motor to, so it freewheels in one direction, and when the electric start motor engages, it will turn the engine over. So that's pretty much it for the fasteners, or all the stuff that's holding the motor together. Now we just take all the fasteners that hold the cases together here. So internally there's a couple, there's 5 or something, yeah, 5 of them. Fortunately all these are all going to be the same length. I think there's one long one in here, if I recall. Okay, that one's gonna pull them all out. And I put the oil cap back in just so it wasn't dripping. The strainer has been removed. All the same size, same length fasteners here. And it might be also worthwhile taking the oil pressure sensor off. You'll need a 21mm socket to remove that. And the reason being is you want to clean all the passages out. When you take this motor apart, we're going to want to clean all the passages. This is your center stand pivot. It's 2 O-rings. Typically you replace the O-rings and re-grease this shaft here. And now the case, there's a tab here and a tab here to tap on to get the case. As long as everything's taken apart pretty easily, it will separate no problem. And you can see there's some galling on this surface here, this thrust surface. And the only way you would ever fix this is if you replace the whole entire engine cases. And I've found on many cases where engines have been starved of oil, the main bearings always tend to survive. And even with the small amount of galling on these cases, they're still usable. But all this stuff, the metal from the main bearing, that all has to be cleaned out of the engine case in a parts washer with gasoline or whatever, some type of solvent. But typically, I've only seen 2 cases where I've had to replace the engine cases because these main Babbitt bearings have been damaged. They have a small amount of damage, but I find that usually the crank will just lose the big end and you'll be fine with the and same goes there. You can see this does not turn. And it should spin freely, has all the free play, but the main surfaces look very nice. There's very little galling. It's just they tend to tear up a little bit of the thrust surface on these, and that's still perfectly acceptable, and same with the bearing in there. So this crank is trash. There's 2 types of cranks with these. This is a type 2 crank, has a star 2. There's a type 1 and a type 2. It's also marked on the cases. There's a way of finding out what the clearances of the engine case, but we would replace the crank with another type 2 crank. So crank is trash. The top end, I'll check the valves to see if those are leaking. I suspect the top end's all going to be usable, with exception of maybe the cam and the exhaust rocker, you know, having some galling on them. This is just a little cap. The O-ring gets replaced. There's also metal in here. So all these parts, I take the tire off, clean all this stuff thoroughly inside the parts washer. So that pretty much sums up a complete teardown of the modern Vespa 300 motor. And if you're tearing down a LX150, ET4, a GT200, they're all very, very similar to this design. You know, there's just some variations on how the electric start system works, on the stator, if they're air-cooled, liquid-cooled. They all pretty much have the same style fasteners in the same spots. It's all pretty much similar. Even the new Primaveras, that's a completely redesigned motor, but a very similar layout. Look forward to doing part 2, where I'll have all these parts cleaned up and show my findings and what we'll replace to put the bottom end back together. See you guys next time. Robot here, Vespa Motorsport, scooterwest.com.